This will be a continuation from some of the elements of my previous video, specifically the parts touching upon education and learning. I will specifically be speaking about what I observed having been heavily involved in advanced placement courses. The topic of educational decline is one very overdone. It has been a popular talking point for every generation forever, with the elders remarking on how terrible the schooling system has gotten, and the youth remarking on how impractical the knowledge is. This is not what I would like to talk about. Instead, I would like to focus on what has been left out of schooling, and what has been left out of the conversation regarding schooling, and some recent developments that may have escaped everyone's attention. I went to a private school until my freshman year of high school, which I am immensely grateful to my parents for. What I encountered in the state schools was honestly tragic in terms of how much knowledge has been obfuscated from my peers. In that state high school, the first 2 years of advanced English were filled with very basic grammar and very low-level books. It was astonishing to me that after the 10th grade, there still existed some of my peers that did not even know what a preposition was, let alone other more specific parts of speech. This sounds like elitist nitpicking, and that was just one example, but this adds up whenever you try to work with or rely on those peers in regards to writing. I am not at all joking or hyperbolizing when I say that only a small minority of them can put together a readable paragraph or even fluently read a paragraph aloud. This complete mismanagement and inhibition of grammar takes a very long time, which is time not spent reading anything classic or anything informative. This means that my generation has not even been made aware of key Western literature to even begin wondering about reading it. That is actually underselling the issue. I distinctly remember various teachers lambasting works outside of class like The Lord of the Rings for being too European, too boring, and not diverse enough. It should hardly be news that the state education system is actively hostile to your literary heritage, but I think the scale of what they are not teaching is often lost. Mark Twain's work, for example, which was a very low bar for classics a few generations ago, is not read. Basic literature like Frankenstein or any of C.S. Lewis's works are left out entirely. Tales and stories like Sherlock Holmes or Robin Hood or Paul Bunyan or King Arthur have gone completely untold. Now I could spend hours ranting about what was not taught, but it would be much faster to just say what we did have. Before I do, though, it is vital to understand that the omission of material is much more impactful and insidious than hot-button cancellation of classic books. If a teacher does not like a book or doesn't care enough, they can just never mention it. They can just forget about it, and the students will never even know of it. This is especially effective when the student population just does not read, as was discussed in the last video. This method has flown entirely under the radar, and it has shelved almost everything of worth. This is why it is imperative to teach your own children and learn for yourself. With that being said, here's what we had. In high school, we read a handful of modern classics like To Kill a Mockingbird and other civil rights literature, maybe 4 selections from Shakespeare, 1 novel by David Baldacci, some founding documents, 1984, a short story about the Civil War, The Crucible, and a book on the Holocaust. That makes this an average of about 4 pieces of literature a year, with half of those being founding documents. While reading these pieces of literature, the teachers will often allow for class discussion, guiding malleable opinion leftward. In terms of poetry, we reviewed maybe 10 poems in all 4 years, with the vast majority of them crammed into 1 semester during the senior year. That was it, and the subject was taught so dryly and lifelessly that there is little to no want among my peers to seek actual classics for themselves. Anything that is not on that list was completely untaught. And as for the years before high school in the state schools, there is even less reading, only going over a few less complex poems and short modern novels. More insidiously, the state schools have taken to outsourcing the teaching of reading to a program called Reading Plus, which now takes until the 12th grade under this new system. This will have students waste time trying to pick out the letter C from lines of the letter O, or flashing a random selection of 3 letters at them for a millisecond and having them type what they saw. This will be an assignment for maybe 30 minutes a week. Besides this, the program had a selection of various readings selected by the company that it would test the students over. These ranged from findings about the wondrous benefits of eating bugs, pieces extolling the virtues of antinatalism, typical civil rights era holy texts, feminist fiction, self-described articles on critical theory, and a couple of modern poems. This was implemented officially to improve reading ability from the school board, but with the reading selections on that list, it should be clear to you what it is really about. Moving to the subject of advanced history, nobody in the state schools care. The state history classes are corpses where only the most basic of Whig history is absorbed and little of substance is taught. I can break this up into 3 categories: geography, United States history, and world history. They pack freshmen into a geography class called Advanced Placement Human Geography, where they will try to imprint on the young minds the dogmas of environmental determinism and neoliberal policy. They spend weeks on demography, using it as a reason to encourage mass immigration for cheap labor and pensions, while promoting contraception among the native population as a part of demographic transition. Thomas Malthus is covered extensively, and his theories are treated as undeniably true. Culture is taught to be viewed in purely material analysis. What does any of this have to do with geography, you might ask? That is a wonderful question, because only single-digit amounts of my peers even know where major nations lie on the map, let alone physical features. Outside of the Rockies or the Appalachians, I'd expect maybe 5 could point to another major mountain range on the map and accurately name it. These are, once again, just quick examples to illustrate the complete lack of basic, foundational knowledge in the field. Thankfully, very few paid any attention to the propaganda that the geography class threw at them, but they have certainly absorbed parts of it. The idea of historiography being anything other than a straight line to progress is entirely unthought of, and why would they even begin questioning it? They don't care, and they don't have the foundation to begin analyzing what they were taught. In Advanced Placement United States History, my school was extremely lucky to have a teacher that decided that the curriculum did not go far enough, taking his own time to create such an in-depth course that I cannot think of anything that was left out. This class had everything from the first colonies in the Americas up to the end of the Clinton administration. Another nice thing about this class was that it was so dense in primary accounts and comprehensive overview that there was little in the way of propaganda. There was a lot of work involved in this class as a result, with one full essay due every week and a bunch of smaller essays due every couple of days over the aforementioned primary sources. This unfortunately means that maybe a dozen people took this class yearly, with the other school teachers and administrators and students lambasting it for being too dense or too serious. Of those dozen or so that did take the class, only about half of them passed the test at the end of the year, blaming their shortcomings on the complexity of the class rather than their lack of effort, further scaring away potential students. At least, that's how it all was, but the teacher that ran the class died only a few months ago, and likewise, so did his course. World history was very similar to human geography, except that the topics were somehow even more shallow. The course began with 1-paragraph reviews over a few Chinese dynasties and a few major Indian kingdoms from about 0 AD to 1200 AD. Then it tried to cover every major world religion in a short paragraph summary. Then it shifted focus to world trade, spending a couple of weeks on medieval African kingdoms and a very shallow overview of the Silk Road and various Arab kingdoms. Then it shifted focus to the Mongol Empire, documenting very briefly who Genghis Khan was, and then quickly listing off the places that his horde conquered. The collapse was briefly covered, Then the focus shifted to studying Eastern Africa, where I got yelled at for suggesting that East African history might have been studied more if they wrote it down. Then we went back to talk about the Islamic Empires, stopping briefly by Europe to discuss feudalism and the Reformation. After that, it was on to the Ottomans and the Safavids, then to the advent of world trade. Then it was quickly on to industrialization and World War I. Then the school shut down in August. Keep in mind that each of these topics were covered to the depth of maybe 2 or so paragraphs, and any events outside of the topics listed were just not taught. Despite this, a good chunk of the class failed the test. You might reasonably think that learning no history is better than learning wrong history, but the way that these schools teach history is so dry and lifeless that it puts its students off from actually trying to learn the subject. That is the key issue here. The state schools function as a deathbed where interest and energy and curiosity go to die. Mathematics was pretty average in terms of content, I'd say, although the state school system had a way of punishment for those that decided to avoid it until the 9th grade. The state schools would allow their students to go up to 1 or 2 classes ahead in mathematics, for example, studying geometry in the 9th or 8th grade instead of the 10th grade. Most people that came from private schooling should have been 2 classes ahead, but the state would bar them, only allowing them to be 1 class ahead for no other reason stated than because they were part of the private system. Here, the state was teaching something correctly, but it used its local monopoly on high school education to punish anyone whose parents were foresighted enough to keep their children away from it as long as possible. The state school taught science in 3 fields: chemistry, physics, and biology. Chemistry was going well, but the man who taught it virtually forever was canned. The field is now being taught by a biology teacher who learned the material the day of teaching it, despite having other, more qualified educators for the class. The class had no one that passed the test, as they did not even get through half of the material in the year. In complete contrast, physics was handled well, and I can't think of anyone that has any major complaints about how it was taught. Biology was more of a course in dogma. The first half of the class was actual biology, but then the class morphed into a theology class, extolling the doctrine of evolution as a dogma beyond reproach. Evolution was first introduced into the class through preemptively countering its critiques. Students would stay after class, gossiping about the potential of other students disbelieving the dogma. It turned into a pseudo-religion. To really complete the picture of how bad this class was, though, I need to convey to you just how much time we wasted on trying to clarify the difference between sex and gender when we went over chromosomes. This cost us over a week, on top of also being complete and total propaganda, and it resulted in us not having enough time to cover maybe a quarter of the total material. As for everything else, there was an extremely bare-bones philosophy class going over the absolute minimum of Aristotle's teaching. There were also music appreciation classes that had to be taken if the student was not in a music program. These were basically just a brief and elementary overview of some music history and what different musical genres are. There was also a very basic economics class that barely made it to the concepts of supply and demand by the time the year was over. Don't ask me how they wasted so much time, for I do not know. That is it. Anything not on this list in terms of literature or historical events is not taught. Ancient history, logic, speaking, actual geography, European history, workshopping, poetry, and now most of United States history, chemistry, and biology are either not at all taught, virtually untaught, or propagandized to the point where the concept taught is so far removed from the original subject that it cannot truthfully bear its name any longer. This all sounds rather catastrophic. Wouldn't this be major news if the decline was so massive and widespread? Well, the state school system and its enablers have been systematically slackening standards in a trend known as grade inflation. If you look at the trend that is linked in the description, you will see that the average GPA over time is increasing across the board. If you watched my last video and have so far listened to this one, you should be able to arrive at the conclusion that it is very unlikely that we are just becoming more intelligent over time. Rather, the schools have been quietly lowering standards. They did this not so quietly, but nevertheless just as insidiously, with the introduction of Common Core. Now, there are 1,000,001 reasons to dislike Common Core, but the introduction of a set of minimum standards just showed the state schools how much less work they had to do, instead of showing them what they needed to improve on. And further to that point, the consequences of the insane measures taken during the 2020 shutdowns are going to continue to crop up as this generation finishes out its education. For the school year 2019 through 2020, all advanced placement tests got simplified to maybe a quarter of the usual material while handing out the same college credit. Most schools passed the whole class as it stood in the spring of 2020. The amount of rigor required to pass a test has sharply declined and not returned to pre-shutdown levels, as most tests of knowledge have been or are being phased out. This means that the schools are now not even trying to test knowledge or even the application of knowledge, but have just resolved to test effort. Most homework, and even quizzes and tests, have been moved online, where it is impossible to ensure any academic honesty. Most homework assignments now allow multiple or even infinite retakes of the assignment. There also exists the option to retake quizzes and tests, or to correct them, and such a thing is very common. This means that Zoomers can just bomb tests, do them over, and have little to no repercussions. Even if using exams or tests to measure intelligence is faulty, at least using them shows that the end goal is for the student to have a sufficient knowledge of the subject. If you allow endless retakes for homework, and allow second chances for quizzes and tests, the quality now being tested for is not knowledge, but effort. Effort is great, and it certainly has its place, but ensuring that someone has the knowledge of a field is vital. This generation that was pushed through the state schools on inflated grades and surviving off of effort instead of knowledge is eventually going to have to work in fields that require perfect accuracy. Medicine, architecture, and civil engineering, just to name a few fields, are all eventually going to have to be staffed by Zoomers who will have no clue what they are doing because they have yet to encounter strict standards. Let me ask you, do you expect your electricity to be in constant supply and its infrastructure to be maintained in the hands of generations that know progressively less and less and tolerate increasingly lower standards? So what is to be done? If you are a parent, keep your children out of the state schools. Try to teach them folklore, poetry, read to them, and encourage their academic interests so they do not burn out in the state hell system. If you are a student, start searching for what has been kept from you. It is out there now, with more ease of access than ever before. The state school system has, intentionally or not, completely destroyed the knowledge and the will to learn of an entire generation. You can very easily be the exception to this. Almost every dystopia predicts a future where information is hidden or destroyed, and where the population cannot feasibly access even a book. Few of those dystopias reflect our present day, where information sits unutilized due to apathy and boredom. So go utilize it.